Moving into this new apartment was an excellent decision. At least, that's what I thought at first. The rent was reasonable, and the apartment was comfortable for a single guy like me. Little did I know, my life was about to take a terrifying turn in the basement of that apartment. It was a dark and unsettling basement, like in spooky movies. I swear I felt a chill run up my spine every time I stepped into what seemed like an abyss. The dim, flickering lights lit the small stairs that led to the basement. I had made many uneventful trips to the basement before, yet on this trip, perhaps it was a sixth sense, my heart raced with each step. As I descended, I could hear the creaking stairs echoing off the concrete walls. A damp and musty odor assaulted my senses as I took each step. Without warning, a chilling reality hit me like a ton of bricks. In the far corner, there was a crumpled body. I stumbled back as my breath caught in my throat, unable to comprehend what I saw. As I approached, the scene was horrifying. Blood covered the floor, and someone had positioned the body upright. I couldn't escape the sense of terror that washed over me. It was like stumbling into the set of a real-life horror film. Breathing was difficult because of the basement's nauseating odor of decay. Questions and fears raced through my head. Who could have done such a thing? Was this a recent murder? There had been reports of a serial killer active in the area for several months. Could this be his evil handiwork? My mind was spinning, trying my best to hold back the growing panic and the bile in my throat. I made my way to the stairs, nearly tripping over my feet. I stopped in my tracks when I heard footsteps coming down the stairs. I almost called for help, but paused. What if the killer had returned? Survival instinct took over, and I ducked behind a stacked pile of boxes and hoped that whoever it was, they hadn't noticed me. The steps got closer, and my fear grew. The individual stopped near the body, and I heard deep, labored breathing. I sunk deeper behind the boxes, my hands trembling, sweat trickling down my forehead. As I carefully shifted my position, a figure came into view. It was a man wearing dark clothing with a hooded shirt. I struggled to control my breathing as my heart raced. I knew any noise might reveal where I was hiding. His face twisted into a menacing grin as he surveyed the carnage around him. He came closer to the horrific scene in the corner. I felt sick. My mind raced. It jolted me out of my thoughts when he turned and scanned the basement, as if sensing he wasn't alone. I held my breath, hoping that he wouldn't see me. I was losing what looked like a bizarre hide-and-seek game. He shifted the body, and then looked straight at me. I became immobile and lost the ability to even scream. With a menacing glint in his eyes and a twisted smile, he lunged in my direction. Terror flooded my veins, and I raced back to the stairwell faster than I'd ever thought possible. His loud footsteps quickly approached me as I ran. I could hear his heavy footsteps getting closer with every step I took. I reached the stairs and started to climb them, taking them two at a time. My legs burned with the effort, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving and get away from this maniac. I stumbled on the last step and fell onto the floor that led into the basement, scraping my palms on the rough concrete. I got up quickly, brushed off my pants, and looked behind me. The killer was there, just a few feet away. His twisted grin replaced with a look of fury and determination. At that moment, I knew I had to fight. I had to protect myself no matter the cost. I searched around me for a weapon, but there was nothing. No pipes, tools, or chairs. I was defenseless. I summoned my last bit of strength and rolled quickly away from the basement door. I could make it several feet, got up, and ran to the exit door. I fled the basement without looking back. I didn't stop until I got to the relative safety of the nearest corner party store, where I locked the door behind me while still feeling my heart thumping in my chest. With trembling hands and odd looks from the store's cashier, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. I spoke as clearly as possible, given the situation. The operator promised to dispatch the authorities to the scene. My thoughts returned to the terrifying scenes from the basement as I waited for the police to arrive. Who committed this terrible act? Were there other victims? My uneasiness grew as time passed. Every noise made me jump, fearing the man from the basement was back. Sirens reverberated through the building. A sense of relief washed over me as I saw the police arrive at the apartment building. I hesitantly headed back to the apartment building. Eventually, the police questioned me, and I answered all their questions, leaving nothing out. It became clear during the investigation that this was not your typical crime. As I had guessed, the missing man's body was likely the work of the serial killer who had been active in the area for months. The police believe he had concealed his victims in the basement before dismembering them and moving the bodies. From what the police told me, I had surprised the killer in the basement. After I managed to escape, the killer hesitated long enough for the police to apprehend him while he attempted to reach his car parked down the street. That night in the basement still haunts me. I keep seeing that body in my mind, and I can't shake the feeling that someone is watching me, and the maniac is still lurking in the shadows.
I hated my basement. I can never quite explain why, but something about it always gave me the creeps. Maybe it was the faint smell of musty air and mold that seemed to linger in the air. Maybe it was the way the stairs creaked and groaned with the slightest pressure. Or it could be the feeling of being watched, even though I knew I was being a bit paranoid. As a recently divorced middle-aged woman, I guess you could say I was learning how to live alone again. Regardless, I found myself in my basement that day. I had come down to grab a few things from storage. I was rummaging around, trying to ignore the chill in the air and the darkness that seemed to be closing in on me, when I heard footsteps above me. It was a soft, light sound, like someone walking slowly on the hardwood floors in my living room. Instantly, my heart began to race. I knew there was no one in the house except for me. Who else could it be? My mind raced with 1,000 possibilities, none of them good. All I could think about was getting out of the basement as quickly as possible. I jumped to my feet and looked around, looking over to the stairs leading up to the main floor, the only exit available. I quickly started to climb the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. However, as I reached the halfway point, something made me pause. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure standing at the top of the staircase, looking down at me. I reflexively let out a gasp. The figure at the top of the stairs remained motionless, their face obscured by the shadows. I could make out the figure's silhouette against the light from the living room, but it was hard to make out any features. My heart raced even faster as I tried to determine who or what it could be. Was it a burglar? A ghost? I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. "Hello?" I called out tentatively. With every second that passed, it became apparent to me that this figure meant to inflict me harm somehow. My mind raced, and reluctantly I turned and rapidly went back to the basement, taking the steps 2 at a time. I had no more than gotten to the basement when I could hear the intruder begin to chase me. I realized right away that returning to the basement was not ideal, as it offered no other escape route. But the only exit was blocked by the menacing figure above, and I had no other options. I began to run, my feet pounding against the concrete floor. I could hear the figure behind me, footsteps growing closer and closer. Panic overwhelmed me, and I felt my legs nearly give in beneath me. Fear gripped me, filling my mind with visions of what horrors awaited me if I were to be caught. Just when I thought I was about to be caught, I noticed a rake propped up against the basement wall. I immediately grabbed it and turned to face my assailant. As the attacker lunged at me, I swung the rake as hard as possible, missing by inches. As I raised the rake again, prepared to try a second blow, the figure pinned me against the wall. At this point, I could tell the assailant was a man, and I could feel his hot breath as he whispered in my ear that he would make me regret my efforts with the rake. As he grabbed my neck and began squeezing, I mustered all the strength I had left, still holding the rake, and raised it up as hard as I could, nailing him between his legs and the groin. He loosened his grip, yelled loudly, and doubled over in pain. If I was ever going to escape, I knew it was then. Pushing him away from me as hard as I could, I ran toward the staircase, nearly tripping over my feet more than once. As I was about to take the first step, I heard his footsteps behind me. I felt his hand on my shoulder as I made it halfway up the staircase. I was able to make it to the top and burst into the kitchen. Breathless, I scanned the room for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes settled on a large knife lying on the counter. Without hesitation, I grabbed it and turned to face my attacker. He had followed me up the stairs, his hand still clutching his crotch in pain. But as soon as he saw the knife in my hand, he paused momentarily. It was enough time for me to gather my courage. "Stay back," I warned him, brandishing the knife in front of me. He laughed, a cruel sound that made my blood run cold. At that moment, I heard a knock on my front door. I hesitated, torn between my desire to answer the door and fear of being vulnerable to my attacker. But the knocking persisted, urgent and insistent. We both stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. But the knocking continued, growing increasingly urgent with each passing second. Without warning, the man turned and ran out the back door of my house, leaving me gasping with relief. Without hesitating, I dropped the knife and ran to the front door. My relief at seeing my neighbor Dan standing on my front porch was nearly overwhelming. Realizing immediately that there was a problem, he opened the storm door. Dan said he'd seen a suspicious character looking in my living room window and decided to come over and check on me. I took a deep breath and tried to calm myself. "Someone broke in," I said, my voice shaky. "I don't know who it was, but I managed to scare the maniac off." I realized just then that I needed to call the police. I grabbed my phone and called 911. The operator listened intently, and as I spoke, I could feel my heart rate slowly returning to normal. The adrenaline rush was beginning to dissipate, replaced by a deep sense of exhaustion and shock. Within a few minutes, several police cars pulled up to the house with their lights flashing. Dan and I stepped outside to meet them. I told them everything I knew, leaving nothing out. In the middle of asking a question, the officer interviewing me received a call, looked at the phone, and excused himself while he took the call. After a few minutes, he returned and informed me that a patrol car had picked up a man who met the description of the man I'd given them. Relief washed over me as I realized the intruder most likely had been apprehended. As the police continued to take my statement and process the scene, my mind drifted to all the what-ifs. What if Dan hadn't been there? What if I hadn't been able to scare off the intruder? These were all very sobering thoughts. The next day, I went to the police station and was able to ID the man who had shattered my sense of peace one afternoon. He eventually accepted a plea deal, as evidence existed that connected him to at least 3 other home invasion and assault crimes. The plea deal ensured that he wouldn't see freedom for several years. A few months later, I decided to put my house up for sale and relocate a couple of hours away. This move was a breath of fresh air, signaling the start of something new. The past had almost consumed me with terror and fear. It was time to rebuild and reclaim a sense of normalcy and safety in my life again.
I try hard to forget that terrible night, but it always finds a way to haunt my dreams. So often, when I close my eyes, the memories of that fateful evening come flooding back. It's almost as if the darkness of that night will never go away. I experienced the events of that night about 5 years back. I'd only been 27 at the time. The night began with friends at a nearby bar. It was just another typical night of joke-telling, cold beer, and unwinding from the day's stress. But as midnight approached, I left, and soon after, the nightmare began. My small apartment was in one of those run-down, dilapidated structures outside town with a creepy-feeling basement. After entering the building, I passed the basement door. I was near the elevator when I thought I heard someone whispering and a slight thud. I had never ventured into the basement, so I hesitated briefly before opening the door. The light at the top of the staircase did not work, so I used my phone's flashlight for guidance. As I crept cautiously down the stairs, each emitting a loud groan beneath my weight, I felt increasingly uneasy. A strange smell lingered, a mix of dampness and another scent I couldn't place. I felt uncomfortable but kept going, even though my heart was racing. Calm down, I thought. Your imagination is getting the best of you. So I kept going. As I descended, the air seemed to grow heavier and more oppressive. Once I reached the bottom, I took a moment to survey my surroundings. A typical basement with piles of dusty boxes and furniture. The air was musty with a hint of mildew. I briefly shined my phone's flashlight around the basement and decided there was nothing to see, and decided to return upstairs. However, as I turned to leave, I noticed a fleeting movement off to my side. As I swung my flashlight toward the motion, what I saw next took my breath away. In the corner, a man was bound, gagged, and terrified. I immediately went over to him and was fumbling around for a bit, freed him from the ropes holding his wrists together. The newly freed man wasted no time removing the gag from his mouth. He cried out in a raspy whisper, "Please help me. They've kidnapped me and they're coming back." I had difficulty following what I heard because my mind was racing. However, footsteps interrupted the man's frightened expression before I could reply. He pushed me behind a row of used boxes and told me to hide. "Oh God, they're here," he whispered. I followed his instructions despite my alarm and confusion and held my breath as the footsteps grew louder, hoping they wouldn't hear me. 2 figures emerged from the shadows. They grabbed the man as he tried to escape. A sickening smack echoed as the kidnappers threw him against the nearest wall. He promised not to run and begged the kidnappers not to kill him. They chuckled as they told him he was worth more alive than dead. A last-second order from one man directed all 3 to move. Even from behind the boxes, I could see the man's feet stumble and trip over themselves, while the 2 figures behind him gripped his shoulders and forced him forward. Before I had time to plan a course of action, the basement door slammed shut, engulfing me in darkness and leaving me alone in the dank basement. The silence in the basement was deafening, and I realized I had to leave and call for help as soon as possible. Fear crept up my spine at the thought that the captors might return at any moment. My thoughts raced with fear and desperation as I stood in the oppressive darkness. I stumbled around, searching for any sign of light. I felt lost and terrified as the shadows seemed to engulf me. My hands shook as I fumbled in my pocket, remembering I had put my phone there. The dim screen only illuminated a small area. I inhaled deeply, turned on the phone's flashlight, and cautiously examined the basement. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that the kidnappers might reappear. The idea of coming across them again was terrifying. To avoid the captors, I set out to find a safer way out of the basement. A sliver of light was eventually visible in the basement's corner. I moved closer with renewed hope, and as I did, I saw the crack revealing a small door. As I forced the door open, I could barely fit through because of its narrow width. The door made a loud squeaking noise as it opened. There was a narrow passage on the other side. I squeezed through the small opening and was in a smaller, colder space. The dampness on the walls and the stuffy air momentarily took my breath away. As I moved through the confined space, time seemed to drag, and my heart beat faster with each step. The claustrophobic space made me feel trapped, but I didn't panic. After an eternity, a second room finally emerged from the passageway. The room gave the impression of being abandoned because of the dust-covered objects, creating a ghostly atmosphere. As I looked around, the scene before me began to make sense. I could hardly believe it. A secret passageway connected my apartment's basement to the adjacent building's basement. In the second basement, stairs led to an outdoor door. I emerged into the shadowy glow of the nearby streetlights. A feeling of relief washed over me as I hurried to the nearest police station, my mind racing. I told them every detail, trying hard not to leave anything out. The police listened to my story and sent a team to the building. I informed the officers that the perpetrators and victims had already left and that I was unsure when they might return. As I waited a safe distance outside, I eventually heard much shouting, followed by 2 gunshots. The sound of the shots jolted me out of my thoughts. Shortly after, the police returned, slowly guiding the shaken man forward. His eyes were wide and unfocused. He had a gash across his forehead, and dried blood was caked around his ears. But he was alive. I asked the police about the gunshots I heard. They continued to escort the man to safety and didn't answer my question. Later that evening, I learned that the captors had returned to the basement with their captive shortly after I escaped, and that it was there where the perpetrators were surprised by the police. The kidnappers then made the mistake of drawing their weapons on the police. The police responded with deadly force, severely wounding both the captors. News of the kidnapping and events in the basement spread. The kidnappers later admitted they had kidnapped the man to collect a gambling debt, and that the kidnappers targeted the man's wealthy relatives in town for ransom. However, as often happens, even the best laid plans can change without notice. I was shaken by the fact that I would have been killed if I had not missed crossing paths with the kidnappers by mere minutes. I had escaped with no time to spare. I will never forget the surprise of finding a kidnapped man in that basement on an otherwise peaceful night, an event that forever changed the lives of all involved. I moved out of that apartment shortly after the horrific events of that night, but the strange basement and what happened there left a lasting impression on me.